Imagine a product so powerful it could finance endless wars, keep empires alive long after they should have collapsed, and make the wealthiest families in history even richer while ordinary people footed the bill. A product so invisible that most citizens didn't even realize they were trapped inside it, because it was sold not as a scam, but as safety. That product is the bond, a simple promise on paper, a debt obligation with interest, a tool that rulers have used for centuries to disguise their hunger for power as fiscal stability. And yet, behind the ink and signatures lies a hidden truth. The bond is not just a contract, it's a trick that makes the future profitable long before it arrives, a trick that keeps nations dependent on borrowing, and a trick that always breaks when the bill comes due. In this episode of Ledger of Power, we are not just talking about finance, we are dissecting the weaponization of debt. How kings, emperors, bankers, and politicians learn to raise money without raising taxes, to fund wars without asking permission, and to quietly transfer wealth from the many to the few, all through bonds. Because the truth is this: history's greatest empires were not only built with armies, with ships, or with gold, they were built on promises, on endless pieces of paper that bound future generations into chains. And history's greatest collapses? They came when those promises snapped. So let's go back to where it all began. Not in Wall Street skyscrapers or IMF boardrooms, but in the merchant cities of early modern Europe, where the first modern bonds were born. Cities that discovered you didn't need to dig mines or conquer new lands to fund expansion. All you needed was trust and a clever enough trick to monetize it. The Dutch Republic in the 17th century was a small cluster of provinces surrounded by powerful enemies. Spain still loomed as an imperial threat. Wars were constant and money was always short. But the Dutch had an innovation that changed everything. They sold bonds not just to elites, but to ordinary citizens. Imagine being a baker in Amsterdam or a ship captain in Rotterdam, and suddenly being able to invest in the survival of your country. You handed over your savings to the state, and in return, you got a piece of paper, a promise that the government would pay you back with interest. On the surface, this looked like patriotism, community, even democracy. In reality, it was the first mass debt trap. The government could now fight wars indefinitely, because instead of running out of treasure, it could sell the future. Citizens believed they were lending for their nation's freedom, but in truth, they had bound themselves to an endless cycle of taxation and repayment. Every interest payment to the bondholder came from somewhere, from duties on bread, on beer, on salt, from the daily consumption of ordinary people. The Dutch showed the world that debt could be packaged as stability, and the investors, of course, loved it. Because bonds, unlike merchants' risky voyages or speculative ventures, were considered safe. What could be safer than the government itself promising to pay? But safety, in this case, was just another word for transfer. The rich lent to the state, and the poor paid the taxes to fund the repayment. The ledger of power tilted upward. England was quick to notice. In 1694, with war against France draining the treasury, the Crown created a new institution that still dominates global finance today, the Bank of England. On paper, it was a central bank. In reality, it was a machine for selling government bonds on an industrial scale. Wealthy investors bought bonds, the bank managed the flow, and suddenly England had an endless pipeline of credit. No longer limited by gold or silver reserves, the monarchy could finance wars indefinitely. Think about that. Before bonds, a king could only fight until his treasure chest was empty. After bonds, he could fight forever, as long as citizens kept believing in the promise of repayment. And every bond issued was another string tying the future to the present, another tax obligation, another silent shift of wealth from households to creditors. This is the trick. Bonds look like safety, they look like patriotism, they look like progress, but what they really do is buy time for governments while quietly stealing it from the people who have to pay it back. And here's the cruelest irony. The safer the bond looks, the more dangerous it becomes. Because the more investors trust it, the more governments borrow. The more governments borrow, the deeper the dependence. And eventually, there is no way out except collapse, inflation, or default. The history of the bond is the history of this cycle repeating, endlessly, ruthlessly, across every empire that thought it had found the secret to eternal power. The 17th century Dutch Republic was small, vulnerable, and constantly at war. Spain threatened it from the south, rival merchants challenged it on the seas, and money was always short. But the Dutch had discovered something more valuable than gold. They had discovered the bond. Instead of taxing their citizens into revolt or depending on erratic streams of silver from the New World, the Dutch government offered its own people a deal. Lend us your savings now, and we'll pay you back with interest later. To the average citizen of Amsterdam, Rotterdam, or Utrecht, this seemed like a patriotic duty. You weren't just buying a piece of paper. You were buying survival for your country, and people believed in it. Bakers, brewers, ship owners, artisans, they all poured their money into government bonds. What they didn't realize was that this act of loyalty also chained them to an endless cycle, because every guilder they lent would be repaid not by miracles, but by taxes. Taxes on bread, on salt, on beer. The daily life of ordinary people was now tied to feeding the government AS debt machine. This was the real brilliance of the Dutch system. It disguised dependence as participation. Bonds looked safe. Bonds looked noble. But they were, in truth, a transfer of wealth from the many to the few. The investors at the top received secure interest payments. The costs were spread across the working population through duties, levies, and indirect taxes. For the first time in history, debt was not just a private burden. It had become the architecture of state power. And the trick worked. With its bond-financed navy, the Dutch became the leading maritime power of the age. They dominated global trade, colonized faraway lands, and held their own against empires much larger than themselves. But their success did not go unnoticed. England was watching. By the end of the 17th century, England faced its own financial crisis. Wars with France drained the treasury, the monarchy's credit was in shambles, and traditional methods of raising money, squeezing nobles, taxing peasants, seizing church lands, were exhausted. In 1694, the English crown borrowed an idea straight from the Dutch playbook and institutionalized it on a scale the world had never seen. They created the Bank of England. On the surface, this was a noble project, a permanent institution to stabilize the kingdom's finances. In reality, it was a machine designed to sell government bonds on an industrial scale. Wealthy investors would buy bonds, the bank would manage the flow of money, and the monarchy could wage wars without worrying about empty coffers. The innovation wasn't the bank itself, it was the bond market behind it. For the first time, a government had created a permanent system of borrowing from its own people, rolling over debt indefinitely. The debt never had to be repaid in full. It only had to be serviced. Interest payments funded by taxes that reached into every tavern, every workshop, every household. Think about what this meant. Before bonds, a king could only fight until the treasure chest ran dry. After bonds, he could fight forever, as long as people kept believing in the paper. War was no longer limited by reality. It was limited only by confidence. The bond market became England's ultimate weapon. Through it, the crown financed endless wars with France. Through it, Britain built the largest navy in the world. And through it, London grew into the beating heart of global finance. By the 18th century, British bonds weren't just safe investments, they were considered the bedrock of international finance. But the safety was an illusion, one built on shifting the burden downward. The rich lent to the crown and grew richer from secure interest. The poor paid through consumption taxes, customs duties, and indirect levies that kept the bond engine running. Stability for the few was purchased with sweat from the many. And there was another consequence. Once governments discovered they could raise limitless money through bonds, wars changed. Wars grew longer, bloodier, and more global. The 7 Years' War, the Napoleonic Wars, the endless clashes of the 18th and 19th centuries, all of them were made possible by the bond market. Empires that once might have collapsed under the cost of war were kept alive by promises written on paper. But here's the catch. Promises pile up, debt accumulates, and when the future finally arrives, the reckoning is always brutal. Some nations, like Britain, managed to sustain the cycle for centuries by exploiting colonies, raising taxes, and maintaining confidence in their credit. Others found themselves crushed when investors lost faith. The same trick that built empires also destroyed them when the ledger tipped too far. That is the dual nature of the bond. It is both the scaffolding of empire and the hidden crack in its foundation. It buys time, but time always comes with a bill. And when that bill cannot be paid, collapse is inevitable. By the dawn of the 19th century, the bond market wasn't just a clever tool, it was the lifeblood of empires. Britain, fresh from its experiments with the Bank of England, had proven that bonds could finance war on a scale unimaginable in the medieval world. The Napoleonic Wars raged across Europe for more than 2 decades, and while France relied on plunder, Britain relied on bonds. Investors across the kingdom bought government debt, confident that their money was secure because Britain controlled the seas and commanded vast colonies. With those borrowed funds, the crown paid soldiers, supplied ships, and armed allies. It was the first truly modern war, financed not by treasure but by promises. But promises have consequences. By the end of the wars in 1815, Britain's national debt had ballooned to staggering heights. Entire generations were bound to paying interest on the money raised to defeat Napoleon. The elites who had lent to the crown grew richer. Ordinary citizens, meanwhile, paid the invisible tax of debt service through higher duties on everyday goods. Once again, the ledger of power tilted upward. The lesson was clear. A nation with strong credit could fight forever as long as its citizens tolerated the burden. And for much of the 19th century, Britain perfected this model, turning London into the world's financial capital. The city of London wasn't just a marketplace for goods. It became a marketplace for promises. Sovereign bonds from around the world traded there, from South America to the Ottoman Empire, and investors grew rich lending to governments thousands of miles away. But if London was the hub, the United States was the rising star. During the American Civil War, both the Union and the Confederacy turned to bonds to finance the bloodiest conflict in the nation, or S history. Abraham Lincoln's government issued greenbacks, paper money backed only by trust, while also selling bonds to investors. The Confederacy did the same, printing graybacks and flooding the South with paper promises. For a time, both sides believed the trick would hold. But the South discovered the brutal truth. When confidence dies, bonds die with it. Confederate bonds collapsed in value as inflation spiraled. Soldiers were paid in paper that could barely buy bread. Families saw their savings wiped out. The war was not just fought with rifles and cannons, it was fought with debt. And in the South, debt lost. The Union fared better because its bonds were backed by the growing might of northern industry and, crucially, the confidence of European investors who bet on its survival. After the war, America emerged scarred but intact, and the bond market was cemented as the foundation of its financial system. By the late 19th century, bonds weren't just about wars. They were about progress. Railroads that stitched continents together, factories that powered industrial revolutions, and cities that rose from the ground were all financed by bonds. Governments issued them, corporations sold them, and investors bought them, believing in a future that seemed unstoppable. But the same trick, repeated often enough, always leads to collapse. In the early 20th century, global debt markets exploded. Nations borrowed heavily to finance World War I, and when the war ended, the bill was catastrophic. Germany, crushed under reparations from the Treaty of Versailles, printed money to cover its obligations. The result was one of the most infamous bond and currency collapses in history, Weimar hyperinflation. A loaf of bread that once cost 1 mark soared to billions. Bonds denominated in German marks became worthless scraps of paper. The people who held them, mostly ordinary citizens, were destroyed. Meanwhile, the elites, who had real assets, land, factories, foreign currency, emerged stronger. The pattern was the same as it had been in Rome, the same as in France, the same as in Britain. Promises collapse, but power flows upward. The 20th century saw the bond trick evolve into something even larger. After World War II, the creation of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank institutionalized debt as a global product. Nations in crisis could borrow, but always on terms set by their creditors. Structural adjustment, austerity, privatization. These were the conditions imposed in exchange for loans. Bonds became not just financial products, but levers of political control. Nowhere was this clearer than in Latin America during the 1980s. Flush with petrodollars in the 1970s, Western banks eagerly lent to developing countries, selling them bonds and promising prosperity. But when U.S. interest rates spiked under Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker, those debts became unpayable. Mexico's default in 1982 set off a regional crisis. Suddenly, entire nations were trapped in a cycle: borrow, default, restructure, and borrow again. The cost was devastating. Governments slashed social programs, unemployment soared, inflation ravaged households, and decades of development vanished overnight. Yet the bondholders, the banks, the IMF, they profited. The same paper promises that ruined millions became instruments of control, tools to dictate policy from Washington and New York rather than Mexico City or Buenos Aires. This is the darker truth of the bond trick. It doesn't just move wealth upward within nations, it moves sovereignty outward, from nations to creditors. A state that cannot pay its bonds is a state that no longer governs itself. Its budgets, its priorities, even its future are rewritten by those who hold the paper. By the end of the 20th century, bonds had become the most traded financial product in the world. Governments issued them daily, investors treated them as safe havens, and global markets depended on their constant flow. Yet beneath the surface, the cracks were already forming. Debt had become permanent. The trick was no longer about borrowing for emergencies. It was about borrowing forever. And when you borrow forever, collapse is inevitable. By the dawn of the 21st century, the bond trick had become so deeply woven into the global economy that most people couldn't imagine life without it. Bonds were no longer occasional lifelines for governments. They were the bloodstream of the financial system itself. Every day, nations issued bonds. Every day, investors bought them. Pension funds depended on them, banks held them as safe reserves, and central banks used them to manipulate entire economies. The world had been re-engineered to live on debt, to treat the future as a permanent product that could be sold and resold endlessly. But when a system grows this dependent, the cracks eventually widen into collapse. In 2008, those cracks became chasms. The collapse began not with government bonds, but with private ones, mortgage-backed securities. These were debt instruments packaged and sold as if they were safe, as if they were backed by the rock-solid promise of American homeowners. In truth, they were a castle built on sand. Millions of loans given to people who could never repay them, bundled into products investors around the world believed were as good as bonds. When homeowners defaulted, the illusion shattered. The value of those securities imploded, banks collapsed, trillions evaporated. But here's the key. Who paid for the collapse? It wasn't the bankers who engineered the scam, it was ordinary people. Millions lost their homes, millions more lost jobs, pensions, and savings. And the solution chosen by governments? More bonds. The U.S. Treasury issued unprecedented amounts of debt to bail out the financial system. Central banks like the Federal Reserve began a program called quantitative easing, creating trillions of dollars out of thin air to buy government bonds and mortgage securities. On paper, this was stability. In reality, it was the same trick, disguising crisis with promises. By buying bonds en masse, central banks drove down interest rates and inflated asset prices. Stocks surged, real estate rebounded, bondholders grew richer, but ordinary people saw little benefit, except for stagnant wages and rising costs of living. The bond trick had saved the system, but it had also deepened its addiction. Because once you rely on central banks to keep printing money to buy bonds, you can never stop. Every wobble in the markets requires another intervention. Every downturn demands another injection of debt. The system is kept alive, but it is also kept fragile. By the 2020s, the numbers were staggering. Global debt surpassed $300 trillion, more than 3 times the world's annual economic output. Governments borrowed endlessly to cover deficits, to fund wars, to patch crises, to subsidize industries, to bail out banks, to keep the machine spinning. And the illusion of safety remained. Investors still treated government bonds as the ultimate safe haven. But here is the cruel irony. The safest product in the world is also the most dangerous. Because when government bonds break, everything breaks. Banks collapse, pensions evaporate, nations default. And ordinary citizens discover that the paper they thought was safe is just another promise that cannot be kept. We've seen this cycle before, in Rome, in Weimar Germany, in Latin America, in Lebanon. The trick always ends the same way: collapse. The only question is when confidence cracks, and who pays the price. And now, on the horizon, there's a new twist to the bond trick, one that should chill you. Central banks around the world are exploring central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs. These are digital forms of national money, programmable at the code level. Imagine bonds, debts, and interest payments hardwired into the very structure of money itself. Imagine loans that can be approved or denied automatically by algorithms. Imagine penalties enforced instantly, wages docked automatically, spending tracked and controlled in real time. To many policymakers, this sounds like efficiency. To the financial elite, it sounds like profit. But to ordinary citizens, it should sound like chains. Because if the history of bonds teaches us anything, it is that every new innovation in debt is sold as safety and progress, but ends in control. Debt was once recorded on clay tablets in Mesopotamia. It was once managed by merchants in Renaissance Florence. It was once formalized in the Bank of England. Today, it is traded in trillions on Wall Street. And tomorrow, it may be coded directly into the money in your pocket. That is the bond trick. A product sold as safety, but designed as dependency. A tool that buys time for governments, profit for elites, and ruin for the people who believe in it. The most profitable product in history until it breaks. And here is the lesson you cannot ignore. History doesn't repeat, but the bond cycle always rhymes. It begins with patriotism, it matures with promises, it grows with greed, and it ends with collapse. If you want to understand power, you must understand bonds, because every empire's fate is written not just on the battlefield, but in the promises it makes and cannot keep. So what should you, as an individual, take from this story? First, never mistake safety for truth. Just because a government calls something risk-free does not mean it is free of risk. Second, build real wealth outside the paper promises of the system, in skills, in assets, in value that cannot be inflated away. And third, never forget that every time you see a bond being issued, you are watching the same trick that has enslaved populations for centuries. The bond trick buys power, but when it breaks ordinary lives. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe to Ledger of Power, because history has the answers, and I'll show you where to look.